Welcome to Deduction Junction, where mysteries unfold and every detail holds a clue. Step into the brilliant mind of Hercule Poirot, the world's greatest detective, as we journey through his most intriguing cases. With logic sharper than a razor and an eye for the smallest detail, Poirot unravels crimes that leave others baffled. Get ready to immerse yourself in a world of suspense, deception, and of course, the little gray cells. The investigation begins now. Chapter 1. A Grave Affair. The morning was unusually crisp for mid-April, the sort of English spring that flirted with warmth but never quite committed. The hedgerows of Sussex were just beginning to bud, and the sun filtered shyly through the clouds as if afraid to overstay its welcome. In the village of Chiddingthorpe, an unassuming cluster of thatched roofs, crooked gravestones, and gossipy tea shops, nothing much happened. That was, perhaps, its charm. The war had left scars elsewhere, but here, time ambled on as it always had, accompanied by the soft clang of the church bell and the rustle of old newspapers over cream tea. Which is why the theft caused such uproar. Not a theft of jewels, not money, not even a work of art, but a gravestone. More precisely, an epitaph, a bronze plaque, embedded into the stone of the late Lady Wilhelmina Halsted's memorial in St. Ethelreda's graveyard. Sometime between Sunday night and Monday morning, it had vanished, removed with surgical precision from its granite setting. No vandalism, no defacement, just gone. And with it, a very particular set of words that had stirred discomfort among the villagers even while they were alive. She knew the truth. She told it once. No one ever quite knew what the line meant. Some had speculated it was a poetic gesture. Lady Wilhelmina was known for her dramatic flair. Others, especially those who remembered her sharper years, whispered that it was something more ominous. A reference, perhaps, to a long-buried scandal. She had been a woman who inspired both admiration and fear, a socialite, a patron of odd charities, and in her final years, a recluse with an iron tongue. When the plaque disappeared, the parish vicar was the first to raise alarm. Then the local paper picked up the story. And soon, word reached London, where a certain Belgian detective sat trimming his mustache in front of a mirror, only half listening to the wireless when his valet entered with the envelope. "From a Miss Halsted, monsieur," Georges said, with a slight bow. She insisted it be delivered personally. Hercule Poirot took the letter, noting with one raised eyebrow the faint scent of violets that lingered on the paper. He opened it with delicate precision and read silently for a few minutes, his face unreadable. Then, quite suddenly, he stood. "Georges," he said, "we must prepare to travel. There is a theft, yes, but one that suggests more than mere mischief. There is psychology in this act." "A theft of what, monsieur?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Of words, Georges, and in words, there is power." The next afternoon, Poirot arrived at Chiddingthorpe, immaculately dressed in grey with a lilac cravat, a small suitcase in hand. The station master blinked twice before recognizing the visitor. Within the hour, the news had spread from the vicarage to the village green. The famous detective had come. He was met at the gates of St. Ethelreda's by Miss Annabel Halsted, the niece and only living relative of the late Lady Wilhelmina. She was in her mid-30s, upright and plainly dressed, with the sort of quiet self-possession that suggested years of patient indignity. "I appreciate your coming, Monsieur Poirot," she said, leading him toward the churchyard. "It may sound strange to those outside the family, but I don't believe the plaque was taken by a stranger. I believe someone wanted that line erased." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Then it is not the value of the bronze, but the inconvenience of its message. That is the motive?" "Exactly. They passed beneath the lich gate, its moss-covered beams casting long shadows over the gravel path. The graveyard was neat and old, the kind that wore its decay with grace. Lady Wilhelmina's grave stood beneath an ancient yew tree, the stone still polished, but now bearing a clean rectangular scar where the plaque had been. Poirot studied it without speaking for a full minute. Then, without turning, he said softly, "Tell me, mademoiselle, was your aunt in possession of a secret?" Annabel paused. She hinted at it, for years, really. She claimed there had been a mistake, something that ruined someone's life. But she never told me what it was, only that she had spoken once and been ignored. Poirot turned to her. And now perhaps someone fears her words might rise again, from the grave. She paled slightly. "You think it could lead to something worse?" Poirot straightened his lapels. "Mademoiselle, the removal of a memorial is an act not of vandalism, but of erasure. Someone is rewriting history. And when one does that, mon Dieu, they are usually hiding a crime." As dusk fell on Chiddingthorpe, Poirot stood alone beneath the yew tree, the wind stirring his coat. "A woman dies," he murmured. "She leaves behind a single cryptic line, and someone long after her passing finds it too dangerous to endure. Why now? And who has the most to lose by remembering?" His eyes narrowed. The game begins. Chapter 2. The gathering of suspects by the following morning, the matter of the missing epitaph had rippled across the quiet corners of Chiddingthorpe with the urgency and drama of a royal scandal. The ladies' embroidery circle debated it over. Sponge cake. The village grocer speculated quite seriously that foreign spies were to blame. And the postmaster, who had once delivered letters to Lady Wilhelmina herself, declared that the plaque's disappearance was a sign from beyond, that the dead had unfinished business. Poirot, for his part, remained characteristically unmoved by superstition. Seated in the Halstead drawing-room, a place of floral wallpaper, ticking clocks, and an overwhelming smell of lavender, he listened intently as Miss Annabel Halstead listed the names of those closest to her aunt during her final years. "There are 7 who visited regularly," she said. "None of them strangers to the family. Some were friends, others—" She hesitated. "More complicated." "Eh bien," Poirot said, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Let us not begin with accusations. Let us begin with character. Who are they?" Annabel retrieved a small leather-bound journal from a side drawer. It was Lady Wilhelmina's appointment ledger, neatly annotated in violet ink. "These," she said, "were the most consistent names in her life at the end." Poirot drew out his notebook. The names were written with care and deliberation. The key first was Reverend Julian Marchmont, the vicar of St. Ethelreda's, a man in his 60s with pale blue eyes and a voice honed for sermons. He had presided over Lady Wilhelmina's funeral and had known her for decades. Stern, scholarly, and famously discreet. "He once said my aunt was the most intelligent woman he'd ever debated," Annabel added, "but he never said it like it was a compliment." Then there was Mrs. Eleanor Bright, a widow who lived 3 cottages down. In her late 70s, but still sharp as a tack, she had shared afternoon tea with Lady Wilhelmina nearly every week, according to her own account. "She's the closest thing my aunt had to a friend," said Annabel, "or at least a consistent presence." Poirot made a quiet note. Too consistent? Dr. Malcolm Finch was the family physician. Middle-aged, mild-mannered, with a habit of fiddling with his cufflinks when nervous. He had attended Lady Wilhelmina during her final illness and certified her death. "He never explained exactly what took her," Annabel said. "Only that it was natural causes complicated by stress." Next came Mr. Gregory Halstead, Annabel's cousin. The only other surviving Halstead by name, though not by much affection. In his 40s, unmarried, and recently returned from a failed business venture abroad. "My aunt despised him," she said flatly, and he returned the sentiment. Miss Celia Morton had once been Lady Wilhelmina's paid companion. A quiet woman in her 50s, she had stayed on for nearly a year after Wilhelmina's death, to help Annabel settle the estate. "She left without notice a few months ago," Annabel said. "No quarrel, just vanished." Then there was Mr. Harold Wren, a solicitor from Brighton, Lady Wilhelmina's legal advisor and executor of her will. He had been in regular correspondence with her for the last decade and visited monthly. His role is practical, Annabel said, but she trusted him. And lastly, Miss Daphne Albright, the young assistant librarian at the Chiddingthorpe Literary Society. Barely 22 and, oddly, one of the last people to speak to, Lady Wilhelmina. She used to deliver books to my aunt, Annabel said, but I sometimes thought my aunt enjoyed their chats more than the novels. Poirot closed his notebook with a decisive snap. C'est bien. 7 names, 7 people with some measure of closeness to the late Lady Halstead, and likely 7 secrets. Annabel frowned. You think one of them stole the epitaph? I do not think, Poirot replied. Not yet. I listen. I observe. But I tell you this, Mademoiselle Halstead, only someone who feared that line would be understood by others would dare remove it. He rose from his chair. I shall begin by speaking with them, not as suspects, but as people. And it is in people, Mademoiselle, where the mystery always lies. The first visitor arrived at the Halstead home just before noon. Reverend Marchmont entered with the grace of someone long accustomed to funerals and polite refusals. Dressed in grey clerical robes, he bowed to Annabel and greeted Poirot with a solemn handshake. I must admit, he said, in a voice like still water, that I hope to avoid involvement in this little scandal, but I understand your need. For clarity, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot nodded graciously. Forgive the intrusion, Reverend. I merely seek to understand the past before it is rewritten. The vicar's eyes glinted. Wilhelmina did like riddles. Even from the grave it seems. Poirot tilted his head. She was a woman of sharp intelligence? Oh, exceedingly, said the vicar. But her faith was unorthodox. She believed in justice far more than mercy, and she carried grudges like relics. Did she ever speak to you of the inscription? Poirot asked. The vicar hesitated. Once. When she commissioned it, she said it was the only sentence she ever regretted saying, and the only one she was proud of. Poirot's brow rose slightly. Curious paradox. Reverend Marchmont offered a thin smile. Lady Wilhelmina was a paradox, and now she's caused one more. As the vicar departed, Poirot remained still, staring at the closed door. Already, the shadow lengthens, he murmured. Let us see how it falls over the others. Chapter 3. Poirot conducts his interviews. That afternoon the sun dipped in and out of cloud cover, casting dappled light through the windows of Halstead House. Poirot requested that the drawing room be arranged for privacy, one armchair for himself, another for his guests, with the curtains drawn just enough to muffle the outside world. It was not an interrogation chamber, but a sanctuary. That, Poirot always believed, was how one coaxed truth from guarded minds. Miss Annabel Halstead observed the preparations with silent curiosity before retiring to her aunt's old study. She understood now that Poirot needed space to work, not with force, but with precision. The first to arrive was Mrs. Eleanor Bright. She stepped into the drawing room with deliberate care, dressed in her best navy coat and a hat adorned with a discreet net veil. Her eyes were sharp despite her years, and her mouth pursed in a way that suggested she expected nonsense and would not tolerate it. Well, Monsieur Poirot, she said as she sat, I assume you've called me here to ask about Wilhelmina, and I'll save you the trouble. I didn't take the wretched plaque. Poirot inclined his head. I do not accuse, madame. I only inquire. Humph. Same thing these days. You were close to Lady Halstead? As close as anyone could. Mrs. Bright replied briskly. We had tea every Tuesday and sometimes Thursdays. She wasn't easy company, sharp as vinegar, but we understood each other. Did she speak of regrets? Mrs. Bright's brow furrowed. Not often. But I remember, just once, she said something peculiar. She said, truth is like a wolf. You can muzzle it, but it still bares its teeth in the dark. I told her she was being dramatic. She said I'd understand someday. Poirot's fingers tapped together thoughtfully. And what do you think she meant? I haven't the faintest idea, said Mrs. Bright. But her gaze lingered on Poirot's face just a moment too long. When she had gone, Poirot made a small note. Tea companion. Resentment disguised as loyalty. The next to arrive was Dr. Malcolm Finch. The physician entered with all the diffidence of a man caught between science and social awkwardness. He shook Poirot's hand politely, but appeared ill at ease in the room's stillness. He declined the offer of tea. I understand you were Lady Halstead's physician during her final illness, Poirot began. Yes. She suffered from hypertension and intermittent heart arrhythmia, nothing unusual for her age. She refused most treatments. And her death, was it sudden? Not entirely, said Finch, adjusting his cufflinks. She'd been declining for months, but on the final night, she simply slipped away, peacefully. Poirot's gaze narrowed. No unusual symptoms? No distress? None that I observed. Poirot let the silence grow heavier before adding, and yet she left behind a rather enigmatic epitaph. Does that not strike you as odd, Doctor? For a woman who died so peacefully? Finch shifted in his seat. I'm a doctor, Monsieur Poirot, not a philosopher. She was eccentric. People say strange things when they know the end is near. But she had it engraved well before her decline, no? Finch blinked. Yes, I suppose she did. When he departed, Poirot remained, seated for some time, his eyes closed. Then he murmured, It is always the polite lies that interest me most. Mr. Gregory Halstead arrived next. He did not knock, he simply entered. Younger than Poirot expected, Gregory was tall, with a carefully disheveled look and a smirk that hovered just short of arrogance. His handshake was perfunctory. I assume this is about the plaque, he said, settling into the armchair like a man taking up court. Poirot smiled faintly. Oui, monsieur. You were Lady Wilhelmina's nephew by marriage? By blood, Gregory said, correcting him. My father was her brother. She disinherited him and me, unjustly, I might add. Yet you remained in contact? Gregory's smile hardened. Contact implies civility. She summoned me once before she died, out of guilt, perhaps. Offered me nothing but advice and insults. Did she speak of secrets? She was a woman of secrets, thrived on them. She liked to hint that she knew things about people, damaging things, but it was all smoke. And the epitaph? Gregory laughed. Pure theater, a final performance. She knew the truth. What truth? That she ruined my father's life? That she kept the Halstead money locked away? Honestly, it was her final vanity. Poirot rose, gently indicating. The interview was over. Gregory stood slowly. You'll find nothing in that plaque but a dead woman's melodrama. But Poirot, watching him go, scribbled one note in the margin of his book. Disinherited. Anger beneath charm. After a short pause, Miss Celia Morton arrived. She looked older than her 50-odd years, with graying hair pulled tightly back and a plain wool coat that matched her quiet voice. I was Lady Wilhelmina's companion, she said. For 6 years. I did everything. Read to her, answered her letters, handled her correspondence. And you left suddenly, Poirot noted. Celia folded her hands. Yes, she asked me to go. One evening she simply said, You mustn't. Be here when the time comes. I thought it was her illness. But then, she paid me very generously and insisted I leave immediately. Did she mention a secret? She said, someone would come looking for her after she died. Someone who would not forgive. Poirot leaned forward. Did she say who? Celia hesitated. No, but I always thought it was Gregory, or perhaps the solicitor. She didn't trust many people, And the epitaph? Celia's voice dropped. She said it was her insurance, that someone might want to bury what she knew, but not if the world remembered. Poirot stood slowly, bowing his head. Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. After she left, Poirot remained very still, then whispered, and now we approach the flame. By evening, Poirot had spoken with 6 of the 7. Only Miss Daphne Albright remained, a curious omission, but one that, to Poirot, carried no small weight. For now, he returned to the graveyard. Alone beneath the yew, he examined the stone once more. The chiseled rectangle, so precise, seemed surgical, not the work of a vandal, but of someone exacting, someone who wanted the memory gone, but the illusion of respect intact. Poirot stooped, brushing a gloved hand over the base of the stone. 6 people, he murmured. 6 memories, 6 versions of Lady Wilhelmina, but only one truth. He stood, and someone fears it still. Chapter 4. The First False Lead. The following morning arrived shrouded in mist, thin and grey, like a veil drawn across the sleepy village of Chiddingthorpe. In the low light, the spire of St. Ethelreda's rose like a phantom above the rooftops, its bell silent. Within Halstead House, however, the silence was restless. Poirot sat at the breakfast table, spreading marmalade across a slice of toast with fastidious care. Across from him, Annabel Halstead stirred her tea, but did not drink it. Her eyes drifted toward the window, her posture stiff with unease. "No word from Miss Albright?" Poirot inquired gently. Annabel shook her head. "She didn't return to work at the library yesterday, nor has she answered any calls at the lodging house. The landlady says she packed a case early yesterday morning, left without explanation." Poirot's spoon hovered just above his cup. "Ah. You think it means something?" "I think," he said slowly, "that Miss Albright has, at the very least, reacted, and reactions, mademoiselle, are most revealing. The guilty flee, but so too do the frightened." Annabel looked unsettled. "You still believe someone feared that line? She knew the truth, would expose them." "I do." "And you believe Daphne knew what it meant?" Poirot did not answer directly. Instead, he pushed back from the table and stood. "I would like to visit her room, if that is possible." Annabel nodded. "Her landlady is a Mrs. Crosswell. She keeps rooms above the greengrocer's." Poirot retrieved his gloves and cane, every motion unhurried, precise. "Let us go, then," he said. "We may find that what was not said will speak loudest of all." The lodging-house was typical of small English villages: faded curtains, floral wallpaper, and the unmistakable smell of boiled cabbage that clung to the stairwell. Mrs. Crosswell, a woman of formidable bosom and cautious expression, met them at the door with narrowed eyes and folded arms. "She left early yesterday," she confirmed. "Said she had to see family in Kent. I didn't press her." Poirot inclined his head. "But she left a case, I think?" "Something she did not take with her?" Mrs. Crosswell sighed and gestured up the stairs. "She paid up through the week, rooms still locked. You can look, but I'll be present." They climbed the narrow staircase and entered a small room, with a single bed, a writing desk, and a modest bookcase. The suitcase beside the bed was packed haphazardly, clothes spilling slightly from the corners. Poirot scanned the room quickly, then moved to the writing desk. The surface was clear, save for a single sheet of paper tucked into the corner of a book on Jane Eyre. He lifted it. A rough note, written in uneven handwriting. "I should have said something, but it wasn't my place. I didn't ask to know, and now I wish I didn't." He passed it to Annabel without comment. "Whatever Miss Albright knew," he said, quietly, "it was not theoretical. It disturbed her." "She was just a girl," Annabel whispered. Why would my aunt tell her anything at all? Perhaps because she was a girl. Or perhaps because she was the only one who listened. Poirot's gaze dropped to the floor, where a faint smear of mud curved from the doorway toward the window. Near the sill, he bent and lifted a tiny object with his tweezers, a splinter of bronze. He did not speak of it aloud. Back at Halstead House, Inspector Crail arrived just before noon. A tall, brisk man with a narrow mustache and a heavy voice, he had the air of someone who found most things beneath his patience, including civilians, libraries, and delicate mysteries. "So you've been poking about, Poirot," he said, not unkindly. "We've had a development ourselves." Poirot gestured for him to continue. "We found Miss Albright at the Brighton station early this morning, luggage in hand. Said she was visiting family, but she couldn't give us a name or an address. She was nervous, sweating." Poirot folded his hands. "And you have charged her?" "Not yet, but the magistrate will see her tomorrow. Frankly, she's the only one we can link to the disappearance. Young, easily led, probably put up to it by someone with more nerve, or simply frightened after the fact." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "May I speak with her?" Crail hesitated, then nodded. "You've a reputation, I'll give you that. But don't take long. The girl's frayed already." The holding room in Chiddingthorpe Constabulary was clean but cold. Miss Albright sat in a chair by the wall, hands clasped, her eyes red. She looked smaller than Poirot remembered, deflated, almost like someone who had surrendered the last of her illusions. When Poirot entered, she looked up sharply. "You think I did it?" "I think," Poirot said gently, "that you know who did." Tears welled at her lashes. "It wasn't me. I swear it wasn't me. But I saw someone that night." Poirot sat opposite her. "Tell me." "I was walking past the graveyard just after sunset. I cut across it sometimes. Saves 10 minutes getting home. I saw someone kneeling by the Halstead grave. They had tools, a chisel, I think." "Who?" She shook her head. "I couldn't see their face. They wore a coat, dark, long, but their movements, they were careful. Not rushed. They knew exactly what they were doing." "Why didn't you go to the police?" "I was afraid. I thought maybe they'd come after me. Or maybe Lady Halstead was hiding something awful. And if I spoke up..." Poirot leaned forward. "Did she confide in you?" Daphne hesitated, then nodded. "She said once, 'The world believes what it's told, not what it sees. But I've seen enough.' Then she said she'd left it behind, somewhere safe. I didn't understand what she meant. But she looked at me like she was handing me a secret without the key." Poirot was very still. "Did she give you anything?" Daphne opened her handbag. From a hidden compartment, she withdrew a small envelope. "I was going to burn it," she whispered. "But I didn't. I couldn't." Poirot took it delicately. Inside was a folded paper, handwritten. A fragment, torn from a larger document. He read the words, then read them again, and a slow, gleaming smile curved across his lips. "The first false trail," he murmured, "has ended. And now, Mademoiselle Albright, the truth begins to speak." Chapter 5. The psychological game. It was shortly after 5:30 when Hercule Poirot returned to Halstead House, the fragment of Lady Wilhelmina's note tucked securely in the inner pocket of his waistcoat. The air outside had turned chill, and the branches of the ancient elm trees trembled in a rising wind. Inside, the house remained as hushed and immaculately ordered as ever, but Poirot could feel it, that subtle tremor beneath the surface, the sensation of a structure just beginning to shift under its own weight. In the drawing room, he found Annabel Halstead seated near the fire, a volume of poetry open but unread in her lap. She looked up quickly. "Well?" she asked. Poirot held her gaze a moment, then removed the envelope and laid it gently on the side table beside her. "I believe this," he said, "is what your aunt meant to protect. Or perhaps, what she meant to expose." Annabel unfolded the page carefully, her brow furrowed as she read. He betrayed her once. That was not the crime. The crime was pretending he hadn't. And I will not let the stone lie while the truth still breathes in the village that excused him. She looked up. She wrote this? Her handwriting, her tone. And I suspect there is more where this came from. But the implication is clear. Someone in Chiddingthorpe wronged your aunt deeply, and more importantly, someone feared that truth would outlive them in stone. Annabel's face tightened. You think they removed the epitaph to prevent gossip? Non, mademoiselle, Poirot said softly. Not gossip, revelation. He turned away and began to pace, the familiar rhythm of his footsteps steady, precise. We now arrive at the most delicate stage. The criminal, if we may call them so, is not a violent person. They did not strike in rage or panic. No, this was surgical, controlled. The removal of the epitaph was not destruction, but censorship. He stopped beside the mantelpiece and turned toward her, which means you see that we are dealing with pride, with the fear of judgment, a fear far older and far more dangerous than guilt. Annabel stood. What will you do? Poirot smiled faintly. I will speak to them. Again, all of them. Not to ask new questions, but to repeat old ones. Because when a person lies, mademoiselle, they rarely lie consistently. He began with Mrs. Bright. She arrived again that evening, summoned under the pretense of reviewing Lady Wilhelmina's library for donation. She entered crisply as before, but her eyes darted more than usual, and her fingers toyed with the clasp of her handbag. Poirot wasted no time. You said, he began gently, that Lady Wilhelmina once compared truth to a wolf. That was a curious metaphor, madam, Mrs. Bright sniffed. She was fond of drama, always had a flair for the theatrical. Indeed, Poirot said, and yet her dramatics, as you say, led her to commission a headstone with a most peculiar inscription. Did she ever explain why she chose those words? The older woman hesitated. She only said that she couldn't say everything aloud, that it would be safer if people read it later. Poirot stepped forward. And you did not wonder what it was she could not say? Mrs. Bright's mouth tightened. Of course I wondered, but I respected her privacy. Respected or feared what she might reveal? Her composure cracked, just slightly. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, Poirot replied. And I think you're not alone. Dr. Finch was summoned next. This time, Poirot met him not at Halstead House, but at the village surgery, under the pretense of a routine consultation. The office was tidy, antiseptic, filled with glass vials and tick-tocking clocks. I wish to ask you again, Poirot said, seated calmly across from the doctor, about Lady Wilhelmina's death. Finch looked surprised. As I said before, natural. Causes? Yes, Poirot said mildly. You said she slipped away peacefully, but you also said she refused treatment. And yet, she paid her companion handsomely to leave without explanation. She wrote cryptic letters. She feared something. Do you not find that inconsistent? Dr. Finch folded his arms. She was under stress. That's not unusual in old age. But this was not ordinary stress. This was a reckoning. She prepared for her death not with serenity, but strategy. I ask you again, Dr. Finch, not what killed her, but who troubled her. The doctor stood abruptly. I have patience. Waiting, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot nodded, rising without complaint. Of course. But remember, when a woman prepares for war, it is because she knows the enemy already stands in her garden. He left the doctor staring after him. Poirot's next visit was to Gregory Halstead. The younger man was not at home, but at the tavern, glass in hand, speaking with exaggerated cheer to a barmaid. When he spotted Poirot, he straightened. "I was wondering when you'd come for round 2, he said, leading Poirot to a quieter table. "What is it this time? Still hoping I chiseled a stone in the dark?" "I do not hope, monsieur," Poirot said. "I observe," Gregory smirked. "Well, observe this. I had no love for Aunt Wilhelmina, but I'm not afraid of a dead woman's last words." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Ah, but that's just it, monsieur. You may not be afraid of her words, but what about her memory? What about the past?" Gregory leaned forward, his smile fading. "Let me make something clear. My father begged that woman for forgiveness. She turned him away. She took everything, and she enjoyed it. If she thought she could shame us from the grave, then maybe, just maybe, someone decided not to give her the satisfaction." Poirot tilted his head. "Merci, monsieur. You have said something very important." Gregory blinked. "I have?" "Yes," Poirot said, rising. "And you didn't even know it." When he returned to Halstead House, Poirot sat alone in the A study. A small fire crackled at his back. He took out the letter from Lady Wilhelmina once more, then the notes he had made from each interview. Each had revealed a fracture, a crack in the facade. Mrs. Bright had evaded. Dr. Finch had grown agitated. Gregory had revealed too much, but the shape of the puzzle was still incomplete. The edges did not yet align. There was one piece left to be found, the context, the why. He reached for his watch and checked the hour, then he pressed the bell. "Ask Miss Morton to return," he told Annabel, who appeared moments later. "Tell her I have a question, a small one, and a very specific one." That evening, Celia Morton arrived once again, quiet as before, her face unreadable. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, "your time with Lady Wilhelmina was long. You saw her in all moods, yes?" She nodded. "And you remember when she dismissed you suddenly, yes?" "Yes. I ask you now not what she said, but what she feared. Was it one person, or was it something more?" Celia hesitated. She was afraid of forgetting, she said at last, of being remembered wrongly, of being rewritten. Poirot sat forward. Then the epitaph was not a warning to others. It was an anchor to herself. Celia's lips parted. "Yes," she whispered. "That's it. Exactly." Poirot smiled. "Then we are nearly there." Chapter 6. Another crime. Another clue. The wind rose overnight, rattling the shutters of Halstead House like fingers tapping insistently at the glass. By morning, the village of Chiddingthorpe was shrouded in a moody grey that seemed to seep into every corner of the narrow lanes and creeping ivy. Annabel Halstead stood at the window of the breakfast room, her fingers curled around a teacup gone cold. Behind her, Poirot entered silently, examining the glint of her reflection in the glass. "You did not sleep," he observed. Annabel turned, startled. "How could I? This whole thing, this absurd situation, has unraveled into something darker than I ever expected." Poirot inclined his head solemnly. "Indeed, mademoiselle, we began with a theft, but now, I fear, we approach something closer to tragedy." She frowned. "You believe there's more?" "I do. Because those who attempt to bury the truth often find they must dig deeper than they planned." He moved to the sideboard and selected a croissant, inspecting it as though it might reveal its own secrets. "And this morning," he added, "we have proof of that." Annabel's head lifted. "Proof?" "There was a fire," Poirot said calmly, "at the solicitor's office." She stared. "Mr. Felton's?" "Just before dawn. No one harmed, but a portion of the back study was consumed. Strangely, it was the cabinet containing Lady Wilhelmina's legal papers." Annabel's mouth fell open. "That can't be a coincidence." "No," Poirot said. "It cannot. especially not when one considers the effort someone has already made to erase her final words. He paused, then added, "And it is not the first time someone has tried to obscure her records. I learned from Miss Albright that your aunt kept a private box, labeled In Trust for A.H., held by Felton since 1937. I knew nothing of it." "Nor did the clerk," Poirot said. "It was only mentioned in a side ledger, but the contents are now ashes." Annabel sank into a chair. "So that's it then. Whatever it was she wanted us to find, her confession or her revenge, it's gone." Poirot tilted his head. "Do not despair, mademoiselle. Fire destroys, but it cannot undo intention, and I believe we now know her intention." He opened a leather notebook, turning to a fresh page. She was not trying to shame the village. She was trying to defend someone, or perhaps to reveal what was done to them. Annabel's brows pulled together. "Someone like my father?" Poirot said nothing for a moment. Then he closed the notebook. "Let us walk." They took the eastern path from the house, passing through the hedgerow and toward the old folly that sat on the rise overlooking the graveyard. The wind tugged at their coats and whistled in the tall grass. "I never truly knew her," Annabel said. "My aunt. I was a child when we arrived. My father was distant. She was severe, but in her own way. I think she tried to protect me." "She did more than try," Poirot replied. "She orchestrated it." He gestured toward the cemetery gates, where the grave still sat, its headstone clipped and defaced. "She left clues, not for justice, but for understanding. She wanted the truth known by those who would not destroy it. She chose you, and Miss Albright, as her final audience." Annabel looked at him, eyes wide. "But what is the truth?" Poirot didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking briskly back toward the house. They were halfway to the front steps when a voice called out, "Poirot!" Inspector Crail emerged from his motor car, his boots already muddied. His face was drawn with annoyance and barely concealed concern. "We've had another incident," he said. "The groundskeeper found something in the orchard, behind the old stables, buried beneath a loose patch of earth. Looks like a box, burnt at the edges, metal, and it had your name scratched into." Poirot's expression did not change, but Annabel's eyes widened. "Mine?" "No," Crail said. "His." He nodded at Poirot. "Take us there," Poirot said calmly. The orchard was quiet and damp beneath the morning drizzle, the apples not yet fully ripe, the ground spongy with rot and earth. A constable stood beside a shallow pit, where the lid of a blackened tin box had been prized open. Crail crouched beside it. "We haven't disturbed the contents." Poirot knelt and inspected the edge of the box. His fingers brushed away soot. Inside lay a bundle of papers, some brittle, some only partially burned, a small velvet pouch, and a note, protected by wax. "Paper," Poirot read aloud, "for the one who sees. If you are reading this, then the others have failed, or succeeded too well. The rest is in your hands." Signed unmistakably, W.H. Annabel's breath caught. Poirot opened the pouch carefully. Inside was a signet ring, inscribed with the Halstead crest, and a second ring, simpler, gold, a woman's wedding band. He laid them side by side in the box. "Lady Wilhelmina Halstead," he said softly, "did not merely keep secrets. She kept evidence." Back in the drawing room, Poirot laid out the salvaged documents on blotting paper. He worked in silence, occasionally making a sound of displeasure as he deciphered scorched handwriting. Annabel and Crail watched from nearby. The inspector leaned forward. "Well?" Poirot held up a fragment. This was a letter, addressed to a Reverend Dorrington, dated 1946. In it, Lady Wilhelmina pleads for discretion. She writes, "The child cannot suffer for the father's sin. If I must lie, I will, but know that I do so under protest." Crail frowned. "What child?" Poirot selected a second page. "This one refers to a bribe paid to Dr. Altham of Cambridge." It references a correction of records, removal of a name, possibly a birth certificate. Annabelle's voice was barely audible. She changed a birth record? Poirot looked up, meeting her gaze. She changed yours. The room fell into stunned silence. Poirot continued, his tone gentle. Your father, Andrew Halstead, was disinherited, yes, but not for gambling or business failure, as was often whispered. He was cast out for an affair, with a maid in the eye. Household. That maid became pregnant. He denied responsibility, and the child, illegitimate by society's reckoning, was placed in an orphanage under a false name. Annabelle paled. Wilhelmina adopted you at age 6, Poirot went on, under the pretense of a distant cousin's death. But she did so not out of pity. She did so because you were her niece, by blood. And she could not forgive her brother's cruelty. Her entire estate, her final plans, they were shaped to protect you from that scandal. The words hung heavily in the air. Poirot stood, the final page in hand. And that, he said, is the truth someone feared. Not because it condemned Lady Wilhelmina, but because it restored her dignity, and perhaps even her love. Annabelle sat down slowly, her hands shaking. Inspector Crail looked stunned. And the thief? He asked hoarsely. Who took the plaque? Poirot smiled faintly. I believe it is time, he said, to call everyone back to Halstead House. The time for questions has passed. Chapter 7. The Gathering returns. The summons went out discreetly, as Poirot had instructed. No grand announcement, no explanation, only a polite note, hand-delivered by the constable, requesting the presence of each individual who had once formed the orbit around Lady Wilhelmina Halstead. By mid-afternoon, the drawing room was once more full, its air dense with the perfume of lavender and the invisible weight of unspoken truths. Annabelle stood by the fireplace, pale but composed. Poirot, beside her, wore an expression of serene expectation, as though waiting for the overture to begin. Reverend Marchmont arrived first, again in sombre grey, his expression more guarded than before. Mrs. Eleanor Bright followed, brisk and upright, her sharp eyes flicking from Poirot to Annabelle with something close to suspicion. Dr. Finch came next, his movements a touch too rehearsed, cufflinks already twisting beneath anxious fingers. Gregory Halstead slouched in not long after, an air of reluctance clinging to him like mist. Miss Celia Morton entered almost silently, her thin frame seeming smaller than memory suggested, her gaze lowered. Harold Wren, the solicitor, was prompt and visibly flustered, as though still haunted by the morning's fire. And finally Miss Daphne Albright arrived last, clutching her satchel tightly to her chest, her usual quiet demeanor tinged with unease. They arranged themselves with the wariness of strangers on a train, close enough to be civil, distant enough to withhold trust. Poirot stood at the center of the room. You may wonder, he began gently, why I have called you here. There was a murmur of shifting bodies. No one replied. It is not yet to accuse. I have no intention of theatrical confrontations. No, this is a conversation. A final one, perhaps, on behalf of Lady Wilhelmina Halstead. He glanced at Annabelle, who nodded once, then sat. Poirot turned to the others. You knew her in many different ways. Some of you feared her, some admired her, some depended on her. But now, I believe, it is not she who is under scrutiny. It is the legacy she left behind. Mr. Wren cleared his throat. If this is about the fire at my office, I can assure you. Poirot held up a hand. Let us not speak of the fire. Just yet, monsieur. We will speak first of what she preserved. He moved to the small table where the salvaged items had been laid out beneath a cloth. He did not uncover them, not yet. Instead, he looked toward Celia Morton, Mademoiselle Morton. You remained in Halstead House for nearly a year after Lady Wilhelmina's death. Why did you leave so suddenly? Celia looked startled. She hesitated, eyes darting. I had a letter. From my sister. Illness in the family. It seemed best to go. Poirot nodded slowly, as though accepting the answer. But he made a brief mark in his notebook nonetheless. And you, Dr. Finch. You signed the death certificate, yes? Yet you did not specify a cause. Finch bristled slightly. It was complicated. Lady Halstead had heart trouble, but there were other contributing factors. Age, stress, possibly an infection, though she refused hospitalization. She refused many things, Eleanor Bright said, her voice cutting in. But she never refused control. Not once. Not in all the years I knew her. A curious observation, Poirot murmured. And yet, she relinquished much control at the end, to her solicitor, to her companion, to her niece. At that, Gregory Halstead gave a short, mirthless laugh. She didn't relinquish anything. She simply distributed her chains differently. Annabel flinched, but said nothing. Poirot let the words hang for a moment, then turned toward Miss Albright. Mademoiselle, you had conversations with Lady Halstead in her final months. She chose you to deliver her books, yes? The young woman nodded. I thought it was just kindness. Or maybe habit. Did she ever speak to you about family? About regret? She asked about my mother once, Daphne said softly. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now... Her voice faded. Poirot turned slowly in place, sweeping the room with his gaze. She left behind more than property, more than a will. She left questions, questions someone clearly wanted buried. He paused. This morning, those questions surfaced. In the orchard behind the old stables, the room shifted again, attention sharpening, glances exchanged like blades. Poirot did not lift the cloth. Instead, he folded his hands. What we found is not the solution. Not yet. But it is the map. And maps, mes amis, are dangerous things. Because once you follow them, you must arrive somewhere. No one spoke. Poirot's voice dropped. Someone here feared where that map would lead. And so they struck out in the dark. But what they failed to see is that even in darkness, truth endures. He stepped back. Tomorrow morning, I will present what I have found. I urge you all to remain in Chiddingthorpe until then. For what is coming will concern each of you, deeply. Mrs. Bright bristled. Is that a threat, Monsieur Poirot? A courtesy, he replied. A threat would have been less polite. He bowed slightly. I thank you for your time. One by one they filed out, some silent, some muttering, some unable to meet one another's eyes. When the door finally closed, Poirot stood unmoving for a moment. Annabel approached. They're afraid, she said quietly. As they should be, Poirot replied. Because now we are close, not only to the thief, but to the wound Lady Wilhelmina tried so hard to keep hidden. He looked toward the curtained window. And when wounds are hidden too long, mademoiselle, they do not heal, they rot. Chapter 8. Shadows in the Ledger. The day drew on with a stillness that felt deceptive, like the hush before a downpour. In Halstead House, Poirot remained at the writing desk long after the others had gone, his fingers moving lightly across the salvaged documents. He read slowly, lips pursed, pausing often, not because he did not understand, but because he understood too well. Annabel entered quietly with a tray of tea. She did not speak at first. She simply placed the tray down, then stood beside him, gazing at the scraps of Lady Wilhelmina's past. She was always 10 steps ahead, Annabel said softly. Even now. Oui, Poirot replied. But even the most brilliant minds leave seams. It is in those seams, mademoiselle, that truth leaks. He lifted a charred corner of a ledger page. "This," he said, "is the missing piece." Annabel leaned closer. The ink was faint, smudged by heat and time, but the numbers were visible, rows of transactions, carefully recorded. "There's a name here," she said. "Celia Morton," Poirot nodded. "Regular payments, small but consistent, monthly, going back almost 20 years. She was employed here, though." "Yes, but this ledger predates her employment. In fact, it begins shortly after another entry, one marked Removal, 1937. Annabel's brow furrowed. What was removed? Poirot didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned to another page, protected beneath a sheet of waxed vellum. A hospital bill. Paid in full. Under a name Annabel did not recognize, yet the address was Halstead House. The dates aligned too perfectly. "She gave birth," Poirot said, "here, in secret, and someone was paid to forget." Annabel stared at the paper, her voice barely above a whisper. "You mean the maid?" Poirot gave a single measured nod. Celia Morton was not merely a companion. She was a witness, and perhaps more than that. Annabel turned away, gripping the back of the nearest chair. And all this was to protect me? To protect truth, which, to Lady Wilhelmina, was never separate from love. A knock at the door interrupted them. Poirot rose. He did not seem surprised. "I expect that will be Inspector Crail," he said. It was. The inspector entered, trenchcoat damp from rain, expression unreadable. He carried with him a slim case. "I thought you'd want to see this," he said. "It turned up at the post office this afternoon. No return address, just your name." Poirot took the parcel and examined it. Carefully wrapped, postmarked the previous day. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a notebook, plain, leather-bound and well-worn. A small envelope was tucked inside the front cover, sealed with red wax. Poirot opened it. A single line written in careful hand. "Forgive what I could not say aloud." C.M. Annabel gasped softly. "She sent this, Miss Morton." Poirot nodded. He opened the notebook. Its pages were filled with dense writing, dates, recollections, fragments of memory. There were details only someone inside the household could have known. Observations of Wilhelmina's moods, the illness that overtook her in her final months, and more. Poirot stopped on one entry. "She feared someone would strike after her death," he said quietly. "She suspected the plaque would be removed. She even predicted someone would go after the records. There is someone who wishes the past to stay buried," she writes. "He would destroy anything, evidence, name, legacy, to keep the truth from surfacing." Crail stepped closer. "Did she name him?" Poirot tapped the page. "She did not, but she gives clues, references to a quarrel, a letter burned before it could be sent, a threat made in the orchard after dark." He closed the notebook. "It is enough." Annabel looked between the two men. "Enough to know who it was?" Poirot's voice was calm. "It is enough to confirm who feared the truth most." He walked slowly to the window, gazing out at the deepening dusk. Across the hedgerows, the lanterns of the village were flickering to life. Somewhere among them, a final truth waited to be unmasked. Poirot turned back to them. "Tomorrow I shall speak with each of them one last time. Alone. Quietly. And then, Mademoiselle Halstead, I shall tell you what your aunt tried so desperately to protect, and who tried just as desperately to destroy it." He met her eyes, and when the last piece falls into place, the mystery of the epitaph will no longer be a puzzle. It will be a confession. Chapter 9. Quiet Conversations. The following morning dawned brittle and clear, the storm having passed but leaving the landscape washed and subdued, as though the world itself held its breath. At Halstead House, Poirot prepared for his day with meticulous care. He polished his shoes, adjusted his cuffs, and arranged his moustache with an almost meditative precision. Annabel watched from the hallway as he examined himself in the mirror, not with vanity, but with readiness. "You're certain it has to be done this way?" she asked. Poirot turned to her, his gaze thoughtful. "There are truths, mademoiselle, that can only be found in solitude. A man speaks differently when he knows the world is not listening." By 10 o'clock, the first guest arrived, Mrs. Eleanor. Bright entered the parlor with the air of a woman determined not to be rattled. She sat stiffly, her gloved hands resting on her lap like folded wings. Poirot did not press her. Instead, he asked her to describe her longest memory of Lady Wilhelmina. She hesitated. "We met in 22, at a luncheon for the Literary Society. She was already formidable. I was foolish enough to think I could match her. But you remained close," Poirot said gently. "Out of necessity, out of pride." Mrs. Bright smiled thinly. "There is a certain intimacy that grows between two people who know how to wound each other, but choose not to." Poirot nodded. "And you were aware of her decision to adopt a child?" Mrs. Bright's mask flickered, only slightly, I suspected. But she said nothing, and I didn't ask. That was our agreement. She kept her secrets, and I kept mine. He raised an eyebrow. "And what secret was worth your silence?" "Her." Reply was quiet, gratitude. He let her go. Next came Dr. Finch. He entered nervously, dabbing at his forehead with a linen handkerchief. "I've done nothing wrong," he said without prompting. Poirot offered him tea. "You signed a certificate, doctor, not a confession." Finch sat. She was dying. I knew it, but she refused care. Said if she died in a hospital, she'd be forgotten. Here she could at least have control over her ending. And did she? Not entirely, Finch muttered. There was someone else. Someone she feared might outlive her and twist her story. Who? She never said. But she once asked if death certificates could be amended posthumously. I told her no. She looked almost relieved. Poirot let that silence hang. "Merci," he said softly. The next visitor, Reverend Marchmont, entered with a certain weariness. As if he had come to deliver last rites rather than answer questions, he folded his hands. "She was not kind," he said, unprompted, "but she was right, about most things." "She confided in you?" "Only once. After a sermon I gave about forgiveness. She said, 'You speak of forgiveness as though it is owed, but it is not. It is a luxury the dead cannot claim.'" Poirot studied him. "You do not believe she regretted what she did?" Marchmont exhaled. "No. I think she regretted what she didn't do. And that regret, that's what she tried to make right with that plaque." "By writing what should have been said aloud," Poirot murmured. The Reverend gave a nod, then rose to go. The hours wore on. Mr. Wren arrived late, eyes hollow from lack of sleep. "I failed her," he said simply. "I was supposed to protect her affairs, her records. That box, I didn't even know it existed." Poirot offered no judgment. He simply asked, "Do you believe her secrets died with her?" Wren looked away. "No. They were only scattered, and someone's been picking up the pieces." Celia Morton did not come. Her house was found locked, her rooms undisturbed, her bed unslept in. Poirot sent a note through the constable. No reply came. Only Gregory Halstead remained. He appeared after dusk, wearing a coat too fine for the weather, a smirk playing around his lips. "You think it's me, don't you?" he said as he sat. "You've been building to this." Poirot didn't flinch. "I think you resented her. Everyone did. But not everyone forged letters or made inquiries at the registry office under false names." Gregory blinked. Poirot smiled thinly. "You see, Monsieur Halstead, I have eyes in more than one place." Gregory leaned forward, expression hardening. "What exactly do you think I did?" "I do not yet think," Poirot replied. "But I suspect, And that, monsieur, is enough to keep you near." When Gregory finally left, Poirot remained by the fire. Annabel reappeared, her hands clasped together. "Did it help?" she asked. He looked up at her, weary but resolute. "It helped draw the circle tighter. We are near the center now, mademoiselle, one step from the heart of it." He tapped the notebook before him. "Tomorrow," he said, "we finish it." Annabel's voice trembled slightly. "And what if I'm not ready?" Poirot smiled gently. "Then be brave, for her sake and your own." Outside, the wind began to rise once more. Chapter 10. Beneath the surface, the next morning arrived with a brittle brightness, as though the sun had forced its way through the clouds out of sheer obligation. In the village square, life resumed. Its rhythms. Shutters opened, shopkeepers swept their thresholds, and the postman made his rounds. But something in the air felt held back, expectant. At Halstead House, Poirot dressed slowly. Not with his usual meticulous vanity, but with deliberate purpose, like a man preparing for a final movement in a delicate symphony. The drawing room had been rearranged once more, chairs pulled closer, tea laid out with exacting neatness. The salvaged papers were gone, tucked safely away. Only the notebook remained on the table, its cover closed but its weight unmistakable. Annabel entered, quiet but resolute. Her eyes searched Poirot's face. "Today, then?" Poirot nodded once. "We do not present conclusions, mademoiselle." "Not yet. We present alignment. The threads have pulled taut. Now they must reveal their pattern." She said nothing, but moved to the window, gazing out at the long gravel drive. The first to arrive was Daphne Albright. She entered hesitantly, cheeks pink from the walk, her hands tight around the strap of her satchel. She offered a small nod to Annabel, and then looked to Poirot. "You said I should return," she said. "Oui." "Sit, if you please." He gestured kindly, and she took the chair closest to the fire. Her presence, though quiet, grounded the room with something genuine, something untouched by history's weight. Next came Reverend Marchmont, then Dr. Finch, followed in short succession by Mrs. Bright and Harold Wren. Gregory Halstead arrived. Last, this time without pretense, his face drawn, his coat slung carelessly over one arm. Celia Morton remained absent. They gathered in near silence. Poirot stood before them, not as an accuser, but as a witness. "You may ask yourselves," he began, "why you have been called again. I will tell you plainly. It is not to hear guilt pronounced, not yet. Rather, it is to give you the opportunity to listen." He held up the notebook. "This journal was written by Miss Celia Morton. Some of you knew her as a companion, some as a servant. Few knew her as a sentinel. She bore witness to the final years of Lady Wilhelmina Halstead's life, and crucially to the past that shaped them." The room shifted. Wren looked pale. Mrs. Bright crossed her arms. Poirot continued, "This notebook does not name the thief. It does not solve the theft, but it reveals what was worth stealing, and more importantly, what was worth protecting." He looked to Daphne. "You, mademoiselle, were trusted because you asked no questions. That is a rare thing in a village, such as this," to Marchmont. "You buried her, but you never absolved her. That silence speaks volumes." To Finch, "You signed away her life, but I wonder if you also signed away her last act of protest." To Wren, "You managed her affairs, but you overlooked the most important one." To Gregory, "You returned not out of mourning, but necessity, and yet you were not written out. I find that interesting." Poirot turned toward the fire. Lady Wilhelmina was not, by any account, a kind woman, but she was just, and in her own way, she tried to rewrite a wrong with the only tools left to her, secrecy, planning, and a message carved in stone. He gestured toward the space above the hearth, where the missing epitaph had once been drafted, reviewed, and finally chosen. Someone feared that line. Not for what it said, but for what it implied, for what it would reveal when read by the right eyes. Daphne leaned forward, voice soft. What did it say? Poirot shook his head. That, mademoiselle, I shall share only when all are ready to hear it, not before. He moved to the table and opened the notebook, revealing a single folded page within. She wrote this days before her death. It is unsigned, but I believe it was meant as a final testament, not legal, but personal. He did not read it aloud. Instead, he folded it again, placed it into an envelope, and handed it to Annabel. You must read this alone, when it is quiet, and when you are ready. Annabel took it with trembling fingers. Poirot turned back to the others. Tomorrow I shall ask you to return one last time, and then I will speak plainly. There will be no riddles, no more shadows. He gestured toward the door. Until then, I suggest you reflect on what you knew, on what you denied, and on what you were willing to let burn. No one spoke as they left. Only Daphne lingered. I don't think she was trying to be remembered, she said quietly. I think she was trying to be understood. Poirot gave a small, sad smile. Perhaps, he said. But often, mademoiselle, they are one and the same. When she had gone, Poirot sat once more beside the fire. He did not open the notebook again. He only waited, watching the flames dance in silence. Tomorrow, the curtain would rise. But tonight, he would let the shadows speak. Chapter 11. The silence before the storm night fell with peculiar stillness over Chiddingthorpe. The stars blinked. Overhead in a velvet sky, the wind held its breath, and even the owls in the hedgerows seemed subdued. Inside Halstead House, a different quiet settled, one born not of peace, but of anticipation. Annabel sat alone in the study, the envelope still unopened in her lap. The fire had burned low, casting soft gold across the spines of old books and the edge of a worn tapestry. She hadn't moved in over an hour, her gaze fixed not on the flames, but on the letter. At last, she unfolded it. The writing was Wilhelmina's, elegant, slanted, precise. It did not begin with a greeting. If you are reading this, then I have trusted you with more than my name. The letter was neither confession nor apology. It was a reckoning. In measured strokes, Lady Wilhelmina recounted the events of 1937, her brother's betrayal, the housemaid's dismissal, the birth that had been hidden. The name struck from every record that could be reached. She described the shame that followed her family, not because of the scandal, but because of how it had been buried rather than faced. The child was never a secret to me, only to those who refused to bear the weight of their actions. Annabel read in stunned silence as her aunt described her visits to the orphanage, her eventual petition for adoption, the long years spent raising a girl who never quite knew the truth of her blood. I loved you fiercely. I only wish I had done so with less fear. The last line trembled with vulnerability. When they come to tell you what they believe happened, remember this. Some truths are heavier than lies, but they must be carried all the same. Annabel folded the page slowly. She did not cry, but something within her shifted, like frost cracking beneath the first sun of spring. Downstairs, Poirot sat at the dining table, sipping a tisane, embers behind him casting his silhouette long against the floor. When Annabel entered, he did not speak, only gestured gently to the chair opposite him. She sat. I've read it, she said simply. He inclined his head. You are brave, mademoiselle. She gave a half smile. She was braver. Poirot's gaze softened. Oui, in her way. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Annabel asked the question she had held back since the beginning. Do you know who did it? I do, Poirot said quietly. But it is not only about who took the plaque. It is about who needed it gone. who needed the past silenced, no matter how many ashes it took. Annabel closed her eyes. "And you'll tell them tomorrow?" "Tomorrow, yes," he said. "But tonight, there is still time for them to wrestle with their own conscience." He rose and walked to the window, looking out over the moonlit lawn, where the old trees stood like quiet sentinels. "Truth is not always a comfort," he murmured, "but it is always a turning point." Elsewhere in Chiddingthorpe, restless shadows stirred. In the vicarage, Reverend Marchmont sat at his desk, the sermon he had been writing abandoned beside a worn leather Bible. He stared into the darkness, lips pressed together as though bracing for something long delayed. In a modest cottage down the lane, Mrs. Bright poured herself a brandy she claimed never to touch, her fingers shaking faintly as she reread an old photograph tucked into a drawer. Of keepsakes, Dr. Finch lingered in his study, replaying a conversation from decades past, one he had tried to forget, but which now came back with the clarity of a reopened wound. Gregory Halstead stood at his window, jaw tight, watching the lights of Halstead House through narrowed eyes, and, in the guest house where Daphne Albright stayed, a single candle burned beside her notebook. She had written nothing for hours, only stared at a blank page, haunted not by guilt, but by grief for a woman she had barely understood, and now felt she somehow loved. Back at Halstead House, Poirot climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing through the silence. At his door, he paused. He glanced back at the hallway, dimly lit and still. "Demain," he whispered. "It ends tomorrow." And in the room behind him the fire guttered low, its glow fading into the hush of night. Chapter 12. The Unveiling. The villagers arrived just after midday. One by one they entered Halstead House for the last time. Not all had been summoned, but word had spread. Curiosity is a stubborn creature in small places, and this mystery had sunk its roots deep. They came in cautious silence, faces drawn, postures stiff. A few tried to smile. Most didn't. The drawing room had been prepared, chairs arranged in a modest arc around the hearth. Poirot stood by the window, watching the clouds drift across a pale blue sky. Annabel sat quietly at the edge of the room, the sealed letter still folded in her hands. When all were seated, Reverend Marchmont, Mrs. Bright, Dr. Finch, Gregory Halstead, Harold Wren, Daphne Albright, Poirot turned. "This," he said, "is not a court. You are not here to defend yourselves, nor will I deliver justice. Justice, you see, is too often mistaken for vengeance. What I will deliver is clarity." No one spoke. He moved to the mantelpiece. "You all knew Lady Wilhelmina Halstead. In pieces, in fragments. She permitted no one the whole picture. Not until now." He looked to Annabel, then back at the others. The theft of her epitaph was no simple act of vandalism. It was targeted, calculated, a final attempt to silence a sentence written not for the village, but for one person. He opened a slip of paper and read the line aloud, his voice calm. "He who would bury shame in silence becomes the grave of truth itself." A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Bright looked down. Wren paled. Gregory's jaw tightened. Poirot folded the page. She commissioned that line shortly before her death, not as bitterness, but as warning. And when the plaque vanished, it became clear someone feared what it might awaken. He turned slowly. Miss Celia Morton, absent today, though not absent from consequence, left behind a journal. In it, she chronicled Lady Wilhelmina's intentions, fears, and final acts. She knew that the truth would not survive long unless it was hidden in layers. Poirot moved closer to the hearth. And that truth is this: Annabel Halstead is not merely Lady Wilhelmina's niece. She is the child of Andrew Halstead, born of a maid he dismissed, denied, and disowned. Wilhelmina intervened, not to preserve the family name, but to preserve the child from the weight of its shame. Annabel did not flinch. She held the letter close. Poirot's gaze swept the room. "Dr. Finch, your silence certified a death, but also permitted a deception to stand. Reverend Marchmont, you knew more than you admitted. You heard Wilhelmina's confession and kept it from your congregation. Mrs. Bright, you helped arrange the adoption quietly years ago. You did not speak because you owed her something. More personal, your own dignity." He turned at last to Gregory. "You, monsieur, had the most to lose. Should Annabel be revealed as the rightful heir, your claim would dissolve. You inquired at the registry under a false name. You searched for any record to disprove her claim, and when you found none, you sought to destroy what remained. The legal box at the solicitor's office, the plaque, the truth." Gregory stood, abruptly. "You have no proof." Poirot remained unmoved. "No legal proof, perhaps. But Lady Wilhelmina anticipated you. The box in the orchard was no accident. It was a safeguard, a message buried in iron. And the ring inside it? That was not hers. It belonged to your mother's line. She placed it beside her own to show the union she believed should have been honored, but never was." He stepped back. "You destroyed the plaque, but you could not erase the sentiment. It lives now not on stone, but in memory." Gregory's protest died in his throat. He sank back into his chair. Poirot turned to the rest of the room. "I do not call for punishment. That is not mine to give. But I call for acknowledgement, for understanding. The truth has been buried long enough." He turned to Annabel. "She does not need your approval. She has her own blood, and now the truth of it." Annabel stood slowly, eyes steady. "I won't be leaving," she said. "This house is mine, not because of inheritance, but because I was chosen, and she chose well." Poirot smiled gently. "We?" She did, and with that he stepped away from the firelight, his task complete. Epilogue. The grave and the garden spring came quietly to Chiddingthorpe. Weeks passed. The village returned to its rhythms. A new plaque was installed in the churchyard, this one simpler, unassuming. It bore Lady Wilhelmina's name, her years, and only one line beneath. She kept the truth and let it bloom. Annabel visited often, planting white tulips beside the headstone. Miss Albright remained in the village, now head librarian in place of her former supervisor. She and Annabel exchanged letters, though they lived streets apart, full of literary references and inside jokes only Wilhelmina would have understood. Gregory Halstead left quietly. No farewell, no forwarding address. Celia Morton's cottage stood empty. Inside, a single book rested on the windowsill. Its spine read, "The Weight of Secrets," and Poirot. He took the morning train, his suitcase perfectly packed, his coat uncreased, his mustache flawless. As the train pulled from the station, he turned once toward the village. "It is done," he said softly. Then he opened his book and disappeared into its pages, leaving behind a garden, a mystery no longer buried, and a woman who had at last been heard.